Because all data structures are container classes, understanding the syntax of Java generic classes is important. In this video, we will explore some of the important features of that syntax. Let's begin by examining the syntax for declaring generic classes and instantiating objects of such classes. When we declare a generic class, we must include a generic type parameter. This parameter can be thought of as a placeholder for an actual type name. Here is the syntax of the class header for a generic class. Notice that what follows the class name is the generic type parameter that is enclosed in corner brackets. Recall that Java has a widely observed set of lexical conventions. Constant names are all uppercase. Variable and method names are all lowercase, except for the first letter of subsequent words, and so on. The lexical convention for a generic type parameter is a single uppercase letter. To use a generic class, it must be instantiated. Next, we consider the syntax required for such instantiation. To instantiate a generic class, we must supply a generic type argument. Let's consider the specific syntax that is required. The syntax for generic class instantiation is like what is used when a generic class is declared. After the class name, the generic type argument, which is an actual type name, is placed in corner brackets. This actual type then replaces all occurrences of the generic type parameter in the class definition. Interfaces and methods can also be generic and have a similar syntax. The one difference with generic methods is that they do not require explicit instantiation. So let's consider now an example of a generic class. So we'll begin by looking at the class pair. And pair is a generic class, we can see, because after the name pair is the generic type parameter t. And a pair of elements is about the simplest container class that we might construct. So it's going to consist of a pair of elements, and both of those elements again are of type t. It has a constructor, and that constructor has two parameters, both of type t. And in addition to that, we've also included a overloaded toString method, and that toString method will enable us to display a pair of elements enclosed in parentheses and separated by commas. So next, let's look at a main method, and this main method is going to make use of that generic class pair. So notice we have declared here and we have instantiated a pair of integers, and we have supplied inside the corner brackets the type, the actual type integer, and then a second one in which we have a pair of strings. So if we run this now, what we should expect to see as our output is we should expect to see the integer pair output, 1, 2, which we do, and also the string pair output consisting of the words 1 and 2. Next, let's consider the benefits of using the Java generic syntax. Even before the syntax of generics was added in version 5 of Java, it was possible to create generic classes. Such classes were created by making the type of the elements object. Using the explicit generic syntax has advantages. One such advantage is that when an instance of a generic class is instantiated, the type of the elements can be constrained to be a specific type, which then prevents objects of other types from being added to the class. Without the generic syntax, it was necessary to downcast objects that were removed from the collection. When generics are used, objects that are removed from the collection are already of the correct type. Beyond just the ability to parameterize the type of the elements of a collection, the new syntax included some additional features that we will consider next. The first of these is the syntax of bounded types. Bounded types allow a generic type parameter to be constrained to only be a subtype of another type, which is usually an interface. Such constraints are important when specific operations in the bounding type are needed. Let's consider the syntax. Within the corner brackets, the reserved word extends is placed after the generic parameter, followed by the name of the base type. Now let's consider a specific example that uses a bounded type. For simplicity, we will use a generic method, but the same approach would be used with a generic class. This method will test whether the elements of an array are in ascending order. To make such a check, the array elements cannot be just any type. They must be an order type, one which has a compare-to method defined that will enable us to check whether the array elements are sorted. So now let's take a look at this particular example that makes use of a bounded type. So notice here that in my method is sorted, the type T extends comparable. And notice that the development environment is highlighting both comparable and the fact that the compare to method is used. And just to illustrate this point, let's remove the extends comparable and notice what would happen. What happens now is notice that the compare to method turns red and it says that it cannot resolve this reference. So let's put it back to the way that it was, and now look at the main method. In the main method, we're going to make use of this twice. First, we're going to have arrays of integers, and we'll have two of those, one that's sorted and one that is unsorted, and then do the same thing with two arrays of strings. Notice in this case we don't actually have to instantiate the method. So generic methods are slightly different from a generic class. Okay, so if we would run this one, what we should hopefully notice is that the one that we have labeled being sorted comes out true, the unsorted one false, and that's true in both of these cases. Every sorted data structure, as well as the comparison sorting algorithms, will use bounded types in exactly the same way that the method that we just examined does, by specifying that the type of the parameter extends comparable. In addition to the syntax for bounded types, also added in version 5 of Java were wildcards. First, we will look at bounded wildcards, or as they are sometimes also called, upper bound wildcards. They provide a capability similar to bounded types, but with generic collections. They implement what is referred to as use-site covariance. Let's see how the syntax compares with simple bounded types. Notice that in place of the generic parameter, we have the wildcard symbol, which is a question mark. Our example is similar to the previous one, except that instead of an array being passed into the method, a list is passed in. It can be any list as long as it implements comparable. All right, so now let's take a look at the example that we have just described. So this is bounded wildcard, and again it's going to be the same kind of a method, one that checks whether it's sorted, but what's being passed in now is a list of anything that extends comparable. And again, the compare to method is necessary for the type comparable here is necessary for us to use the compare to method. And again, we have up in our main program, we have illustrated that we have that it will work with both types, so the list of integers and then also a list of strings. So if we run this one, we should again see very much the same behavior we saw before, which is that in the case of the arrays that were, or the lists that were sorted, it comes out true. With the unsorted ones, it comes out false. Next, we consider the complementary syntax of lower bound wildcards. The bounded wildcards that we just examined provide an upper bound. Lower bound wildcards provide a lower bound. They implement what is referred to as use-site contravariance. The syntax is similar to bounded types, except the reserved word super now replaces extends. Our example now is slightly different. The method has two parameters, and the second parameter that uses the lower bound wildcard is output from the method. So now we'll look at this particular example. In this example, our method of interest here is the method copyList, and here is what we have just described, the lower bound wildcard. So what is being copied to is a list of anything which is a subclass of T. All right, so what we've done up in our main program is, again, we've got two different types. One is going to be an integer array. The other is an array of doubles, and both of those are subtypes of number. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the list of numbers and the list of integers and the list of doubles and copy them into number. The other thing that we've done here is we've also included a method display, and what this does is it uses just a plain ordinary wildcard. So this is one in which all we do is we indicate the type as being question mark, which is any type. All right, so we'll run this one, and the behavior that we should see is that the two lists, the list of integers and the list of doubles, were both copied. Finally, some observations about the fact that this syntax was an afterthought in the language design, and therefore the considerations that must be made for backward compatibility. To maintain compatibility with programs originally written in earlier versions of Java, generic types can be left unconstrained. Such types are called raw types. When raw types are used, it is the equivalent to using the generic type, constraining it with the type object. Clearly, using raw types in new code is not a recommended practice and should be avoided. There are other consequences of the generic syntax being a later addition to the language. Type erasure is one of them. Type erasure means the generic constraints exist only at compile time and are gone, erased, at runtime. There are also a few restrictions on what is allowed with generics that are noteworthy. Notice that instantiating a single object or an array of objects of a generic type parameter are not permitted unless a typecast is included. The declarations shown in red are invalid, whereas those in blue are permitted. One final note is that one other important restriction on generic classes and methods is that they can only be instantiated for types that are objects, not for any of the primitive types. However, some languages, like C++ and C# do allow such instantiation.